Welcome to the Nourish to Thrive podcast, faith-forward, science-backed strategies for women who want more energy, less weight, and real answers. I'm your host, Tanya Pennington-Miller, a functional nutritional therapy practitioner and functional blood chemistry specialist with a master's degree in applied clinical nutrition. If you're tired of feeling dismissed by your doctor, confused by your labs, and stuck in survival mode, you're in the right place. Here, we simplify the science. We get to the root, and we anchor it all in truth, because God made your body to heal and thrive, not just survive. It just needs the right kind of support and less noise. Hello, my friend. Welcome into the Nourish to Thrive podcast. I'm so glad you're back with me today. So this is it. This is the third and final episode of our cholesterol series. And this is where we're going to pull everything together. So before we get into it, let me do a real quick recap of what we've covered this month, because it all kind of builds toward what we're going to be talking about today. So in episode 60, we really laid the foundation. So what cholesterol is, why your body makes it, and why rising LDL in perimenopause and menopause is very often a hormonal story rather than a dietary one. We talked about how estrogen directly supports LDL clearance through LDL receptors, and how chronic stress drives cholesterol production through the pregnenolone steal. And we established early on that cholesterol is not the villain, it is actually a healer. And in episode 61, we went deep on the markers that actually tell the story. We talked about the difference between reference ranges and optimal ranges, why total cholesterol and total LDL give you an incomplete picture, and how markers like ApoB, fasting insulin, HSCRP, oxidized LDL, Lp(a), and an NMR lipid profile each add a piece of the picture that a standard panel is simply not capturing. So now you have the context, you understand what is driving the pattern. And today we talk about what to actually do about it. So one thing I do want to mention before we get into any specific interventions is that what actually moves the needle is going to be different for every woman. And it should be based on what the markers are actually showing. So someone whose primary issue is elevated triglycerides from blood sugar instability is going to need a different primary focus than someone who's concerned about a low HDL or an elevated pattern B LDL. So use what we talk about today as a framework and not a checklist. And if you haven't yet listened to episodes 60 and 61, I would really encourage you to go back, because the context matters a lot for how you apply what it is that we're going to be covering today. So let's start with food, because this is where I think most women already feel like they are really trying to do the right thing. Like, the most important dietary shift for improving the overall cholesterol picture is actually reducing refined carbohydrates and added sugar. And I know that might not be what you expected to hear first, but remember what we talked about last week. High triglycerides are almost always a blood sugar and insulin story and not a dietary fat story. And elevated triglycerides drive that small, dense LDL pattern that we talked about that is much more atherogenic. Those are the real small golf balls that we talked about. So reducing your sugar and your refined carbs is going to be one of the most direct levers for improving both triglycerides and LDL particle pattern at the same time. And not to mention, it also helps create the healthier terrain that we talked about last week for anyone who does have a genetically elevated Lp(a). The second most important piece is going to be increasing fiber, and specifically soluble fiber. So soluble fiber binds to bile acids in the digestive system, and it helps to carry them out of the body. And because bile is made from cholesterol, this actually supports cholesterol excretion. So when we talked in the last episode about LDL being the reason that cholesterol can even leave your body at all, Fiber is a big part of how that process actually gets completed. So we're talking flax seeds, chia seeds, avocado, berries, apples and pears with the skin on, cruciferous veggies like broccoli and Brussels sprouts, sweet potatoes, artichokes. These are all really excellent sources of soluble fiber. And while we're talking about cruciferous veggies, actually, I do want to give broccoli sprouts their own platform for a minute. So, broccoli sprouts are one of the most concentrated sources of a compound called sulforaphane. And sulforaphane is a powerful activator of what is called phase 2 detoxification, which is the process your liver uses to neutralize and clear toxins, oxidized lipids, and inflammatory compounds from the body. And that is directly relevant to the cholesterol conversation because phase 2 detox supports the clearance of oxidized LDL. And it also helps to reduce the overall inflammatory burden that drives the kind of arterial damage that we've been talking about during this series. So, regular broccoli does have some sulforaphane, but broccoli sprouts have significantly more. Like we're talking somewhere between 20 and 100 times the concentration per gram. So, I personally sprout my own broccoli seeds every week at home. And it's so much easier than it sounds. You don't need soil, you don't need light. Like literally, you need the seeds and you need water. So, I will actually leave a link in the show notes to the kit that I use if you would like to do the same for yourself. A lot of the ladies in my alumni membership are also sprouting their own broccoli sprouts. Now, what about dietary fat? Because I know this is where a lot of confusion lives. The shift I want to encourage here is away from refined seed oils. This is going to be your canola, your soybean, your corn, all of your vegetable oils, and toward whole food fat sources. So, olive oil, avocado, fatty fish, meat from regeneratively raised animals, pasture raised eggs, raw nuts. And the reason for this shift is not cholesterol content, it's oxidation. Refined seed oils are highly prone to oxidizing, especially when they're heated. And oxidized fats in your diet contribute to the oxidative stress environment that we talked about as a driver of oxidized LDL and arterial inflammation. So, this swap is more about reducing the oxidative burden in your diet than it is about reducing fat intake. Okay. Alcohol is also worth naming here because it directly raises triglycerides and it contributes to liver fat accumulation, okay, which ends up affecting how the liver processes cholesterol. When I'm actively working with a woman, we remove alcohol entirely. It is not something she should even consider adding back in until her metabolic health is optimized. And honestly, what I find a lot of times is that once a woman gets to that place and she can feel how good she feels without it, she really doesn't want to add it back in because she doesn't want to lose what it is that she has worked so hard to gain. And I think that is one of the most powerful shifts that I get to watch happen. There's nothing about alcohol that is beneficial for your metabolic health. So I just want you to have that context as you think about where it fits for you. Okay. All right. Let's talk about some lifestyle levers. The lifestyle intervention with the most consistent evidence for improving the cholesterol picture is resistance training, not chronic cardio, resistance training. It raises HDL, lowers triglycerides, improves insulin sensitivity, and it supports healthy body composition in ways that are directly connected to a more favorable lipid pattern. And we talked at length about this back in episode 59, so I'm not going to go all the way in here. But if this is not already a consistent part of your life, it is the highest return on investment that you can make in the whole cardiovascular health conversation. Okay. Sleep is going to be the next lever. And it is more important than I think we often give it credit for, although I do think more and more women are really starting to understand this. Poor sleep raises cortisol, which, as we covered in episode 60, drives the pregnenolone steal and increases cholesterol production while simultaneously reducing the hormones that help clear it. So prioritizing restorative sleep is upstream of almost every other intervention on this list. And then stress. Stress is the last piece here. And I would argue, gosh, it is the one that undoes everything else when it goes unaddressed. We've already talked about why. If your stress load is high and your cortisol is chronically elevated, you are fighting the cholesterol picture from the inside every single day, regardless of what you're eating or supplementing. So, whatever nervous system regulation looks like for you, whether that is a consistent breathing practice, daily walks outside, protecting your sleep like it is a non-negotiable, setting boundaries around your schedule, or leaning into prayer and faith as a genuine regulatory tool. Okay. This is one of the most important things you can do for yourself here. So now let's talk about some targeted supplements and specifically which ones have real evidence behind them in terms of supporting a favorable lipid profile. So let's start with omega-3 fatty acids. So EPA and DHA specifically are probably the most well-researched supplement in this category. They lower triglycerides significantly. They support a more favorable LDL particle pattern. And they have anti-inflammatory effects that are directly relevant to the HSCRP picture. Now, the therapeutic dose for general health support is around 2 grams of combined EPA and DHA daily. But if we are specifically targeting triglyceride reduction, we're looking at closer to a 3 to 4 gram dose. That's higher than what most standard fish oil capsules contain. So you do want to look at the actual EPA and DHA content on the label, not just the fish oil dose. Each fish oil gel cap generally has, now this is generally speaking, but 1 gram. Okay, so you would have to take 3 to 4 of these per day if they even contain 1 gram. Some contain less than that. Sometimes you have to take 2 gel caps to equal 1 gram. My absolute favorite is made by Designs for Health, and it's actually in liquid form because in just 2 teaspoons, you get more than enough of a dose. And it actually doesn't taste bad at all. I just leave mine in the fridge and I'll take a teaspoon or 2 while I'm making dinner. And what I'll actually do is with these supplements that we're talking about today, I'll create a link with all of them if you want to go back and take a look. So that one link is going to contain all of the supplements we'll be speaking to today. Okay. All right, let's move on to berberine, which is one that I get asked about a lot and really I think for good reason. So berberine activates an enzyme called AMPK, which improves insulin sensitivity and reduces the liver production of cholesterol and triglycerides. And the research on berberine for both lipid and blood sugar support is genuinely compelling. And for women who have elevated triglycerides along insulin resistance, it's one of the most targeted options available. And typical doses studied are around 500 milligrams 2 to 3 times daily, ideally taken with meals. Now, I do want to mention my personal preference is actually dihydroberberine, which is a reduced form of berberine with significantly higher bioavailability. We're talking roughly 5 times more bioavailable than standard berberine alone. So you can get similar, or I would say even better effects at a much lower dose. With dihydroberberine, a typical dose is around 100 to 200 milligrams twice daily. And it also tends to be easier on the digestive system than standard berberine, which can cause GI upset in some people. So I have someone actually who tends to get constipated with berberine, does not get constipated with dihydroberberine. So if you are going to look at this option, I would recommend considering dihydroberberine as my first choice. And I'll make sure this is listed in that link as well. All right, bergamot is a citrus extract that has some really interesting research specifically for cholesterol, with evidence for reducing LDL and triglycerides while supporting HDL. So it appears to work partly through a similar pathway as statins, where it inhibits cholesterol production in the liver, but through a natural polyphenol mechanism rather than a pharmaceutical one. So the research is not as extensive as berberine or omega 3s, but it's promising. And I think it's worth considering. I've had a really great experience with this with clients. And I'll make sure this one's included as well. And then we have CoQ10, which I want to specifically mention in the context of statin use because statins deplete our CoQ10, which is an enzyme critical for mitochondrial energy production. So if someone is on a statin and dealing with fatigue, muscle aches, cognitive fog, CoQ10 depletion is often at the root. So my preference here is actually ubiquinol, which is the active reduced form of CoQ10, and it is significantly more bioavailable than the standard ubiquinone that you're going to see in most supplements. This is really important, especially for women in midlife whose ability to convert ubiquinone into ubiquinol naturally starts to decline. So if you are on a statin or if somebody you know is on a statin, this is something that I want you or the person you know to hop on ASAP. So I will also include a link here to my favorite ubiquinol. Okay, let's move on to magnesium, specifically magnesium glycinate or malate, which are going to help to support vascular relaxation, blood pressure regulation, and has some data for favorable effects on cholesterol and triglycerides. And given how broadly magnesium deficient most people are, it is one of the more low risk, high upside additions for women in this audience. So a dose of somewhere around 200 to 400 milligrams every evening is great. For my women who are still cycling, I even recommend up to 800 milligrams the week leading up to your cycle, which tends to help with any symptoms you may be experiencing as your cycle is coming. Okay, fiber supplementation. Now, my preference is always that you get your fiber from whole food sources first. And we talked about several of those earlier, but if you are genuinely not getting enough through your diet, then psyllium husk has some of the most consistent evidence for LDL reduction. Okay. So it works the same way that dietary fiber does. So it's going to bind bile acids and support cholesterol excretion. So if you are falling short on soluble fiber from food, psyllium is a well-researched option. Now, we can't leave this conversation without me touching on red yeast rice. This is another one that I get asked about regularly. And so I want to be really clear about where I stand on it. So red yeast rice is widely marketed as a natural alternative to statins, and it's sold over the counter as a supplement. And on the surface, I think that sounds really pretty appealing. But here's what I think most people don't know. It's that red yeast rice contains a compound called monocolin K, which is chemically identical to lovastatin, which is a prescription statin. It works through the same exact mechanism, inhibiting HMG CoA reductase, which is the enzyme your liver uses to produce cholesterol. So it carries the same concerns that we talked about in episode 60 with that potential CoQ10 depletion and that same potential impact on hormone raw materials. So the FDA has actually tried to regulate red yeast rice products because of this, but it continues to be sold as a supplement. So when someone tells me they're taking red yeast rice as a natural alternative to a statin, what I hear is that they're essentially taking a statin without regulation. And for women in perimenopause and menopause specifically, my concerns about cholesterol suppression in the context of already declining hormone production apply just as much here as they do in the prescription version. So again, if you happen to be taking red yeast rice already, I'm not telling you to get off of it, especially if your, functional doctor puts you on it, but please, please, please hop on CoQ10. Okay. I won't be including red yeast rice in the link with the rest of these supplements. Now let's touch on peptides real quick here, because for those of you who are here in July for the peptide series, here is where some of that conversation intersects with what we have been covering this month. And I want to be really clear here that what I'm sharing is research and educational in nature. These are not mainstream interventions. And as always, please check with your doctor or qualified practitioner before starting anything new. Okay. All right, let's start with MOTS-C. This is a peptide that has been getting attention in the metabolic and longevity research space. It is derived from the mitochondria and it activates AMPK, which we just talked about, okay, the same enzyme that berberine activates. So it helps to improve insulin sensitivity and metabolic function. And because insulin resistance is one of the primary drivers of the small, dense LDL pattern and elevated triglycerides, improving insulin sensitivity through any mechanism is going to show up in your lipid picture. Okay. And you might have heard about MOTS-C as like the anti-aging peptide. Okay. Then we have, and we've already touched on this one as well, GHKCU, the copper peptide, which we covered in episode 57. It has antioxidant properties that are directly relevant here because oxidized LDL, as we talked about last week, is the piece that actually drives the foam cell and plaque formation process. And the copper peptide antioxidant activity helps create an internal environment that is less hospitable to LDL oxidation. So there may be a benefit there. And then we have retatrutide, which we covered in episode 58, and it's in the GLP class. And this particular peptide has specific evidence for reducing visceral fat, lowering triglycerides, reducing liver fat. All three of those directly shift the lipid pattern in a favorable direction. So visceral fat specifically is strongly associated with the small, dense LDL pattern and elevated triglycerides. So reducing it matters beyond just body composition. Okay. It changes the metabolic terrain in a way that shows up on your lipid panel. And, if any of these peptides are something you want to research further, I do want to mention in a past episode, I shared that the only research use only company that I had been comfortable with had gone out of business. And I have since done my research and I have found another one that I feel really good about for those who are looking for research purposes only. So I'll go ahead and leave a link in the show notes for that as well. So here is how I want you to think about taking all of this and doing something with it. Start with your labs. If you do not have a recent panel that includes ApoB, fasting insulin, and HSCRP, then that's your first step. Ask for them. Then use the optimal ranges we went through last week to understand where your pattern actually sits. From there, the intervention priority should follow the pattern. If your triglycerides are elevated, the primary focus is reducing refined carbohydrates and sugar and supporting insulin sensitivity through resistance training, sleep, and stress management. And then berberine, omega-3s, and fiber are going to be your most targeted supplement supports here. Now, if your inflammatory picture is the concern, oxidized LDL, elevated HSCRP, the primary focus is an anti-inflammatory diet, removing seed oils, addressing the oxidative burden, and the omega-3s are particularly relevant here. And then if you find that Lp(a) is elevated, everything above becomes even more important because you cannot change the number, but you can change the terrain around it. And through all of this, the hormonal environment is central to the whole picture. So supporting estrogen as well as possible for where you are in the season that you are in is going to be important because it's upstream to the entire LDL clearance conversation. We are not separate systems. So, and if you haven't looked into the Feminescence Pro line yet that I've been mentioning, I think I mentioned it in episode 60. I'll leave that link again in the show notes for you. And again, as a reminder, there's Feminescence Pro Harmony, pro-peri, pro-post. And if you need any help with deciding which one is best for you, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram, okay, at tanya.pennington.miller. James 1:22 says, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says." And I think about that verse at the end of this series because we've spent 3 weeks building a framework for understanding what is actually happening with cholesterol in the midlife female body. And knowledge on its own does not move the needle. There's a version of engaging with information that feels productive, but does not produce any action. We listen, we nod, we feel informed, and then we go back to doing exactly what we were doing before. And there's nothing wrong with being in a place where the action is not yet clear. That's actually often where more learning belongs. But for a lot of us, the obstacle is not information. We have enough. The obstacle is the doing. So I want to close this series with a simple invitation. Take one thing from these 3 episodes and act on it this week. Just one. Maybe that is adding a consistent daily fiber habit. Maybe it's asking your doctor for a fasting insulin on your next panel. Maybe it is getting your LP(a) run for the first time so that you know where you stand. Maybe it's replacing seed oil that you still have in your pantry with olive oil. One thing, because the women who are the healthiest are not necessarily the ones who know the most. They are the ones who do the most with what they know. Okay. I hope this series gave you something you genuinely did not have before you started listening. A clearer picture of what is driving the numbers, a better set of questions to bring to your doctor, and some direction on what is actually worth doing about it. And if this month has made you think seriously about doing the deeper root cause work, including running a comprehensive lab panel and DNA testing and actually building a personalized roadmap around what your specific body needs, that is exactly what we do inside my DNA Reset for Fat Loss Academy. The link to that wait list will be in the show notes for you. Enrollment opens in early 2027, but being on that list gets you information in the meantime. So next week, we're heading into a Q&A episode. So if you have any questions that you would love to hear answered, send them to me on Instagram, tanya.pennington.miller. And I promise you, I genuinely read every single one. Thank you so much for being with me this month, for staying with me through these 3 episodes on a topic that deserves a lot more nuance than it typically gets, and for trusting me with your time. I will see you right back here next week, sister. That's it for today on the Nourish to Thrive podcast. If you found value here, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or send it to someone who's walking a similar path. Keep showing up, keep asking questions, and know that healing is possible, especially when you trust the one who designed your body to heal. Until next time, stay rooted in truth and nourished in grace.